Welcome to the webinar, everyone. This is Michael Smith from TerraTech, and I'm here with Denny Springle, and we're going to be talking about caching and performance in ColdFusion and solving slow ColdFusion sites that you have. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you should have an ability to ask some questions. I'll keep an eye on those and ask Denny any that come up, and we'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So let's go ahead and let me tell you about Denny. He's been doing ColdFusion for many years, and he's an Adobe ColdFusion Certified Professional. And he also has presented at a lot of user groups and conferences. And he's pretty much an expert on speeding up your code. So let's go ahead, Denny.
All right. Thank you, Michael, and thank everybody for coming. Hopefully you get something good out of this. My name is Denny Springle. I am I'll give you a quick introduction. I'm the owner of a ColdFusion development firm called Virtual Solutions Group, and I'm also the founder of a new ColdFusion open source initiative called Team CF Advance. If you guys are interested, you can learn more about that at teamcfadvance.org. And all right, go ahead and get started with some of this good stuff we got going on here for you today. All right. So first we're going to talk about programming for speed. There's several things you can do. One of them is to write your applications in an object-oriented fashion. OO and MVC are typically engineered, especially under Adobe and Rilo, to function a lot faster than your typical procedural code applications might. The use of encapsulation allows only the functions that need to be fired to fire. And those that don't. So if you do things in an object-oriented way, it really helps speed up the execution of your applications. If you're using MVC and you use dependency injection or aspect-oriented programming as well, that also adds a factor of speed to your applications. Because everything is written on top of Java, typically in the past couple of releases, especially for Adobe CF, they've done a lot better at modeling the ColdFusion object orientation around the Java object orientation so that it's close to a one-to-one when it compiles down to a class as it would be in Java. So that's one of the reasons why it runs faster if you do it that way. And also it makes for happy developers, managers, and customers when you write OO. It has a lot of other benefits besides speed. Another thing that will increase the speed of your application is to always scope your variables. If anyone looks into any of the frameworks and looks into their actual code, you'll note that 99.999% of the time all of their variables are scoped. Scoping your variables tells ColdFusion where to look to find the variable without having to search the stack of scopes to figure out what you're trying to access. It searches those sequentially until it finds a matching variable, starting with the variable scope and then moving through the scopes as needed. And that's time consuming. So if you always scope your variables, ColdFusion doesn't need to do anything except grab that variable from that scope. It also eliminates ambiguity and potential security threats when you fully scope your variables. Ambiguity being things like you have a form.userid and a URL.userid and a cookie.userid, and you just ask for user ID. And it doesn't know if you want the form one, the URL one, or the cookie one. So that's one of the problems you also avoid by fully scoping your variables. The only exception is the variable scope, which even I still write out variables in some instances, but ColdFusion always scans that first, and it's implied when defining a variable. So you don't always have to do it, but I typically do it nowadays. It just seems to be best practice in the community these days to go ahead and put the variables in there as well. So that's a really easy way to speed up your applications pretty quickly. Another thing you can do when you're programming is exit as quickly as you possibly can. What I mean by that is anytime you have logic in your applications, you want to define the logic in an order that gets to the end of processing as quickly as possible and exits out. For instance, you have a form and you're validating whether or not they entered some fields. You want to do that validation right up at the top, up front, before you go through all the rest of the code process. So if they fail the validation, you exit immediately with a message saying, hey, you didn't provide this field. Instead of going through and doing whatever else you might normally do and then waiting till the end with your logic to say, oh, okay, if we don't have this variable, then throw this error. Programmers tend to have a tendency to write logic that checks for error conditions passively, which is at the end. You should always do that as active as possible. It's perpetuated in coding books, and I wish people would stop doing that. But for the most part, always execute and exit as quickly as you possibly can. That will make your applications run just that much faster. It might be a few milliseconds, but when you have 1,000 users, a few milliseconds adds up pretty quick.
That's a great point, Denny, and I just find that when we look at code, people often don't do error checking at the top of their code, so I really appreciate you pointing that out. Let's go ahead and do a quick poll here and see what issues people have with speed on their projects. And if you should see the poll there, you get multiple choice. You can pick as many of these as you want to. And I'll go ahead and close it in a few seconds after folks have had a chance to click on these things. So the options are, maybe your OO code is slow, or your SQL is slow, or tags are slow, functions slow, or maybe you don't know what the heck is slow, but something is slowing things up. So I'll close that in 3, 2, 1. And let's see what problems folks are having. So looks like SQL's the #1 issue, though actually that's behind mystery slow code. So I don't know how that corresponds to your experience, Denny, but that's the results of the poll.
Yeah, most slowness in applications falls under the mystery part of it. You have to do a lot of load testing and regression testing and things like that to really understand what's going on in your application sometimes, especially if you're dealing with really old procedural spaghetti-type applications, which I'm pretty sure most of us have or do at some point in our careers. So yeah, that's definitely something we can, and some of these things I'm talking about now will definitely fall under the mystery slowness category. So when you start writing OO, it makes things go a lot faster. Scoping makes things go incredibly faster. And then exiting is definitely something. Another thing is, not too many people fall into this nowadays, but you still fall into it once in a while. Limit your nested loops. If you're looping instead of a loop, then there's other ways to do that, first of all, but it definitely puts a load on your application server when you start looping instead of loops. I've seen applications that have multiple nested loops inside each other, and then people wonder why it takes forever to load the page. So nested loops are sometimes unavoidable. There are circumstances where there's no other better, easier solution than to do it. But if they can, they should be avoided. It is both a blessing and a curse. It really, if you can test this out yourself, write a loop inside a loop inside a loop, and see how fast that executes, and you'll see pretty quickly that your performance just dies. Let's see. There are other alternatives. You can map your data into a struct, for example. So you have a giant struct that you can then parse through instead of looping through a query, for example, or a set of queries, or multiple queries. You can park those queries as structs inside a bigger struct, and then parse that struct, and that actually goes faster than looping through the loops. And a lot of people simply abuse the ability to nest loops without really realizing the implications that it has on application performance. So that's another thing that you might find in your code that is a mystery until you see it. Another thing is you got to know your ColdFusion. ColdFusion gives you a lot of functions and a lot of tags that seem benign on the outset, but if you do any kind of load testing with some of these tags, you'll find out pretty quickly that some of them are just not worth using. Things like inline if. You would logically assume that that runs as quickly as an if-then-else, but it's not. It doesn't. It doesn't run that fast at all. In fact, it takes a lot more time to run an inline if than it does to do an if-then-else. Other things, struct find. I try to avoid when possible because, again, that takes a struct and then tries to search through the entire struct, and it does that sequentially, so it's kind of the same thing as scoping your variables. CF module, I don't know too many people that use that much anymore, but CF module in itself is just slow. It's actually slower than any other available options to use, such as writing a function and then calling that function, or even doing a CF include of code. All that is much faster. Increment value is another function that people tend to use. It's actually slower than doing a plus variable or a variable equals variable plus 1. It is actually a lot slower. So basically just knowing your ColdFusion and which things work better. Instead of using struct find, you would just define the struct.key. CF include, like I said, instead of CF module, a equals a plus 1 instead of increment value. These kinds of things in the ColdFusion language are process killers. So you got to look around and find out other ways to handle those things. Again, sometimes struct find is something that you have to use because you don't happen to know what's in the struct necessarily, or you want to test for that condition. So that sometimes is easier and is actually faster than doing a different process to get it. But for the most part, try to avoid these things in particular. There's other stuff that you might want to avoid as well. Again, it comes down to just knowing your ColdFusion and what should be avoided.
We've got someone asking a question that, between the difference between is defined and struct key exists, and whether that makes any difference.
Is defined with a struct is actually faster than doing a struct find. So yes, is defined would be faster because it's looking for that particular struct and key.
And right. What about against struct key exists?
Struct key exists is actually also faster because it's only searching the keys, whereas struct find searches the keys and the values.
And any difference between those two, or?
Yeah, I would, if I had to go that route, I would probably still do is defined, because then you're defining the actual key that you're looking for instead of asking it to parse through the list of keys,
right.
For example. So it's still faster to do is
and
defined.
I'm kind of curious what versions of ColdFusion folks are running, so let's just ask that.
Okay.
What, and you can answer more than one of these if you're running multiple ones on different servers. But ColdFusion 10, 9, or 8 or earlier, or Raylo, or some other version like Blue Dragon. So I'll go ahead and close this in a few seconds. 3, 2, 1, and let's see. Well, looks like most people are still using ColdFusion 9, but ColdFusion 10 is catching up, and 8 is starting to fade away. So,
yay!
Yeah. Well, given that 11's about to appear, this is probably a good thing to get your server upgraded. And a lot of the issues with 10 that were there when it first came out have been addressed. So, great. Okay, let's proceed.
All right. Testing your execution speed. This is one of the most often overlooked data points when testing, is execution speed. A lot of people will do everything else but this when they're doing their testing. So testing your code for execution speed is key to understanding which functions take too long. And there's a bunch of different ways to do this. Some have varying degrees of accuracy, but in either case, it'll still show you if one function runs faster than another function, for example. Database queries, math-intensive reporting, internet protocol requests are all kind of no-brainers for taking a long time, and often just working through those are enough to improve your application performance. Locking shared scope variables, for example, is a less obvious suspect to consider, but that actually does blocking on your application or whatever scope that you're in, to that matter, and that can cause your application to slow down as well. So using, not that, but there's times you have to lock, obviously, your shared scope variables, but understanding that if you, I've seen code where you have a CF lock and they set a variable, and then further down the code you have another CF lock and they set another variable, and then further down the code you get another CF lock. If you can put all those locks in one lock and set all your variables rather in one lock, then you'll save the time it takes to lock it 3 times, that type of thing. Using getTickCount, which is a function at the beginning and end of your functions, will help you isolate any problem areas. So, and this is, there's a lot of debate on this as to how accurate getTickCount is, but again, it will help you isolate whether or not one method of a function or another method of a function works faster. So you can use getTickCount to isolate that and keep you from pulling your hair out, as I say here. So this is definitely one of the things that you want to do, especially if you have a page that's loading slow. You can basically do a getTickCount and save that as start time, and getTickCount again when you're done with a block of code, and understand how many milliseconds that code takes to execute. So, and ticks are basically 1,000 milliseconds, if I remember correctly. So if you divide by 1,000, you get the actual milliseconds value. So getTickCount is pretty handy. You can use that all throughout a single, one page of code. You can test out each block of code, each logic block, and figure out how long each logic block takes. You can see how long the entire page takes, and really narrowed your focus down to where in that particular code it does the slowness lie, and what can you do at that point to address it. So it's a very handy function to have. Using stored procedures is another way to rapidly speed up applications, especially when dealing with databases. This answers part of that SQL slowness issue that people have. Stored procedures take away the overhead from your ColdFusion server, and they place it onto the SQL server instead. So the SQL server's CPU and memory gets loaded up instead of the ColdFusion server's CPU and memory processing the query. And most stored procedures will execute faster on most database servers than a query does in ColdFusion. So it's usually a win-win situation. And you have to understand that when you use stored procedures, it literally is a transfer of CPU and memory load from your application server to your database server. So stored procedures will make your application run a lot faster under most circumstances. There are special cases, as with everything in life, but for the most part, using stored procedures will save you a lot of time on the application execution side. So today you won't have a query that still takes forever in a stored procedure to return data, and that might slow up your application, and that's another topic we can discuss. But for the most part, using stored procedures in place of queries will significantly improve the performance of your applications.
Yeah, and I'd have to say that's the number one way I've seen of speeding up applications. Look at the SQL, optimize it, stick it in a stored procedure. And also look at the index. When I say optimize, looking at the indexes you've got on that query.
Absolutely.
I'm kind of curious what database people are using on their apps, whether they're using SQL Server or MySQL or Oracle or even Access or something else. So if you want to go ahead and answer that poll, that would be helpful. And I'll go ahead and close it in 3, 2, 1. And looks like most folks are using SQL Server on their apps, but a significant number are using Oracle. Do you see any, and a few people are using Access, which I have to say for a production app is not a good idea.
Right.
First of all, you don't get things like stored procedures, and secondly, there are some security and speed issues there. So, any thoughts on the different databases that people use?
Oracle lately has been a little faster than Microsoft SQL Server. They kind of swap up every few years. You know, one releases a version that's a little bit faster than the other one, and then that company turns around and releases their version that's a little bit faster than the others. And that's just the competition in that arena. For the most part, Microsoft SQL and Oracle, I would consider enterprise-level databases. If you're down in Linux, Oracle is a good choice if you're doing a production environment. Otherwise, for a developer's environment, something like that, MySQL works great. Postgres works as well. I agree with Michael. If you're using Access, get away from it, move it into a SQL server, and that will significantly improve your performance.
And there's some free versions of SQL Server you can get hold of, and it's pretty easy to upgrade from an Access database. There's some tools that will get you straight into a SQL Server database. Got someone asking about CF query param. I don't know if you think that needs to be still used if you're using stored procedures.
Well, the stored procedure has its own params, and yes, it does the same basic thing that CF query param does. So it will help you block, people trying to do SQL injection and things like that. Typically, from a purely security standpoint, as far as using CF param, CF param helps, but it's not your savior. You should always have a better way of handling SQL injection, whether that's using something like, I just had a brain fart, the Foundio firewall application. I can't remember the name off the top of my head right now. Or you write your own custom code that handles processing the URL for variables.
I think several people, including Cutter and Joss, say it's FuseGuard.
FuseGuard, that's it. So that's definitely one solution. Otherwise, you want to write your own solution to handle checking for and eliminating any inputs that would do that, as far as SQL injection or any type of injection, XSS, any of that.
And then if you're not doing a stored procedure, do you recommend people use CF query param?
Oh, absolutely. That also, aside from just protecting you, what it does on the SQL side is it sets up parameters that are stored on SQL in your SQL environment, so that the next time that query is called, it basically has an execution plan already defined.
So it speeds it up.
Yep. When you don't use CF query param, it doesn't have an execution plan. It has to generate one on every request, every time you fire that query. So using CF query params allows SQL Server, Oracle, and MySQL to all establish and cache execution plans that fire phenomenally faster on every next request of that query.
And Marcel here is asking, are there alternative JDBC drivers you can install to improve speed?
Not really. Most of the JDBC drivers that are out there are optimized by the vendors, such as Microsoft or Oracle. The ones that are in use by ColdFusion, Adobe ColdFusion in particular, are the vendor versions, so you're not going to necessarily get much more speed. There are other drivers out there. I typically avoid them simply for the fact that they're untested as far as I'm concerned in my production environments. Definitely there are some out there that I've heard are faster, but a third party, and you don't, really, or open source. In either case, you are relying on the work of someone else and seeing if that's going to work in your production environment. I would definitely test that first in a development environment. If you find out that works better for you, then go ahead and use it. But security implications are one of the things that you got to be concerned about when you go that route as well.
Right.
If you don't have a vendor-supported driver, then people can take advantage of security implications that you may not even know about.
Okay, well, I think that's covered databases, so what's next?
All right. Oops. All right, now we're going to talk about caching a little bit. So, as you can see at the top here, use caching. Caching is a way of storing data in memory, and that returns a lot quicker. We'll talk about a few different ways to do that. And basically caching is, as I say here, a fancy way of saying keep this just as it is and give it to anyone who asks for it. For performance benefits, it's really nothing better than caching. If you've got a server with a lot of memory, use caching as liberally as you possibly can. If you've got limited memory, then you need to kind of find a happy medium for what really needs it. You can cache pages and queries. With ORM, you can actually do a lot of caching there. There's several layers of caching in ORM, and that provides quicker responses for mainly static data, some dynamic content, and by dynamic I mean content that changes infrequently. You can do some caching for an hour or 2 hours or 24 hours or whatever on content that changes in those time frames. Queries, the U.S. states table in a database is one that I've found numerous times in numerous applications isn't cached. It never changes. We're not adding any more states, so cache it. Cache it and cache it for a long time. And that will always be stored in memory and return the results quickly. And if you use the debugging when you're doing your programming, and run a query against your states table, uncached, and see how long it takes to execute the query, and then run it cached, and see how long it takes to execute the query. It takes 0 milliseconds to execute a cached query because it just pulls it out of memory. So that's one significant way to increase your application performance, is to cache any queries that do not change for long periods of time, any queries that change on a set schedule, and obviously things that change constantly you can't cache, or you can cache but for very small amounts of time.
And I think that depends on how real-time you need the app to be. It may be reports that are 5 minutes out of date are just fine.
Right, exactly. And what that does is allows ColdFusion not to have to process, in case of page caching, the page, or in case of the query, again until the cache expires. So basically it gives instant access to any page and critical data as in reporting. So we'll talk a little bit about how to do this. So page caching is what we'll talk about first. There's a tag called CFCache. You provided a time span using the create time span function, which is days, hours, minutes, seconds, in that order. And then you define what directory the page cache should be using. And that's optional. I always specify my own directories so that I can go back later and clean out those caches if I want to, without destroying everything in all the cache. If you use the native cache, it uses one cache, and if you go to clear that cache, you then either have to define the very specific pieces you want to move out of the cache, or you have to clear the whole cache. So specifying your own directory helps, especially for different pages, having different directories, or different sections of your application having different directories that you can just clear out at once if needed. So you tell ColdFusion to cache the page results by putting the CFCache tag on your page before the code that outputs your HTML, your text, or whatever. And then you end your CFCache tag at the end of that code that you want to have in cache. Let's specify whether the cache page results on the server or the client or both. The default is both. There is a third attribute to this tag that allows you to specify that. I won't show it here, but there's a third attribute for it. The directory on the server in which to store the cache pages, and the time span that indicates how long the pages last until it's automatically flushed. So if you set it for 1 day from the first time it's cached, it will expire, and the next request for that will have to generate the page again, and then it will cache it again for the next 24 hours.
So we've got someone asking if could there be a problem of caching using up too much RAM on your server?
Yes and no. Again, you have to measure how much of your memory you want to make available to that, and then you want to monitor that. If you're on a server that doesn't have the RAM, you want to monitor it closely. If you're on a server that has, nowadays RAM is so cheap that most servers that are coming out these days are 16, 32 gigabytes of RAM. And this RAM that it's using is outside of the JVM RAM, so it does actually use RAM outside of the JVM. In the case of page caching, the data that's actually saved to disk, and ColdFusion, I believe there's a setting in the CFadmin that will specify how large the cache should be. Anything that doesn't fit in that cache, it's a first in, first out type of cache. So anything that isn't in that cache is still stored on disk, and if it's called for later, it just pulls it from disk. So it's kind of a two-step, two-layer process that goes on with ColdFusion as far as page caching goes.
And got Charlie saying that RAM outside the JVM is only true in CF10 by default, and you have to configure it in earlier versions. So.
Right. You're right. Thanks, Charlie.
And Cutter is saying if your page changes infrequently, maybe generate an HTML page when the data changes. That's a great tip, Cutter.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of companies that do that. A lot of the news reporting companies that websites that are using ColdFusion actually on the back end are having ColdFusion generate an HTML page that then gets served by the web server. So there's really no call to ColdFusion from the public-facing site. It's all done on the back end using scheduled tasks and or at the time of article creation. So it's a lot of cool functionality you can do there as well. So yes, good point.
And related to that, Charlie's saying you can't limit the maximum size you use for page casting, just how many cache results you have. So if you've got some really big pages, something else to look out for.
Right. Good point. All right, so partial page caching. This is kind of a trick, more or less. But using CF save content and then storing to your session or session or application scopes, I suppose. If you want to save it across all requests in a session, the request scope, it's kind of pointless, I suppose. But in any case, you can save content to your session scope and then check to see if that variable is stored in your session and has a length. And if it is and does, then you can just spit out that variable instead of going through the processing that is done between CF save content. So this is the way to do partial page caching. So if there's a particularly long-running piece of code, say in reporting, for example, that has to do a bunch of math and pull a bunch of data in, you can save the content that's output into your session variable or your application scope, either one, and then check for it and serve it up to anyone else that comes in for it. So that's a way to use it. So again, by saving infrequently changing but frequently presented complex data this way, you significantly decrease individual page load times because it doesn't have to go through that processing over and over and over again. But because of the overhead of locking shared scope variables, this technique is only really handy when you're generating really complex output. So overuse can actually slow your application down. All right, query caching. Basically, query caching is what you do with the CF queries. You have a cache for them. There's also a cache after, which I've never ever really used and have never really understood why it's there, but it is. But cache within will tell the ColdFusion server to store that query in memory for the length of the create time spent that's provided to it. Again, that's days, hours, minutes, seconds, in that order. let's see, the ColdFusion accesses the database on the first page request and then does not query the database on further requests until the specified time expires. So if you set it for an hour, as I show here, then the first time the query is run, it will go to the database, get the data, pull it into memory, and for anyone else that calls that query for the next hour, it will return the queried results and not results from the database. And again, this is for data that doesn't change rapidly or data that's not time sensitive or critical. Again, depends on how real time your application is. Google AdWords reports are delayed by an hour, for example, and the reason they do that is because they have to process a lot of data, so they have giant servers. They still delay by an hour so that they can query that data on the first time it's called for you, and then show you that same data for the next hour until the next query is called. So that's basically what they're doing. It's the same thing there.
So we've got two things, feedbacks here. One is Michael, Bragg, is pointing out that if you reach the maximum number of cached queries, then it's going to throw away, some older ones when it's filled up that maximum.
Yep.
Yeah. And then also Alex is asking, is there a difference between using caching and just sticking the query into session scope?
Yes, there is. Caching, if you stick it into your session scope, then you're mucking up your session scope with a bunch of stuff you don't necessarily need.
And you'd have to process all the expiration and stuff manually.
Manually, absolutely. If you use cached within, that's going to handle all of that processing for you. All you have to do is just say cache it. So yeah, definitely, if you're doing queries, use the cache within and don't store them in the session scope. Would be my suggestion. And again, you have the locking of the session scope to store the data in there, and that probably is more time consuming programmatically than just using the cache within. I haven't tested that theory, but my hunch tells me it would be slower. Alright, so flushing the page cache, we saw how to put stuff in there. The action equals flush, and you can specify the directory or any wildcard parts of the URL of the directory pattern that you want. So you can flush the entire directory, you can flush specific pages within that directory. And this would be done, for example, I gave earlier where the article writer goes in and writes an article and it generates the HTML and spits it out. I guess that doesn't apply here. Let's say you're using page caching instead of writing out HTML instead, and then they go in and make a change to that. You would want to flush that out of the cache so the next time it's asked for, it returns the new data that was added to that. And that's, if you have a ColdFusion function that updates data, you use the cache pages. That function should include a CF cache tag that flushes all the pages that use that data. Flushing the query cache, this is one that most developers stumble on when they start using cached within. They set their cached within, they do their query, they go and they make a change in the database, and they come back and they run their page again and they still don't see the change in the database. They're like, what's going on here? Not understanding that cached is in memory and it doesn't matter what you do with the database between the time it was created and the time it expires. You're going to get the same results. To get around that, you can specify a cache reason with a create time span of all zeros, and that will flush out the last cache query and pull in the data fresh. Again, that will do that on every request after that, so this is more of a debugging thing than anything else. Or if you're adding data to a table and you want the next pull of the data on whatever page to show the right data that's just been added or updated, then you would have a query that would cache that same query name and with a create time span of all zeros, that will flush it so that next time it's pulled in on whatever other page it's being used on, it'll pull the most recent data.
So got a couple of questions on this. Miguel is asking, is it better to use cache within or to use CF cache on a query?
For queries, it's cached within. Definitely cached within.
And then
you can use both. So you can cache your data and then cache the output as a page cache on your page, so that you don't have to do the processing of the query either, right? So you can do both. But if you're doing queries, yes, you need to use the cache within in order to cache your query. Otherwise, it'll call the query every time.
And then Alex is asking if he's using a framework such as FW1. Can you cache the entire page if you're doing framework coding?
Yes, you can. There's a couple different ways to go about that, depending on what you want to cache. You can either cache at the layout layer, which will cache everything that's in that layout, which is probably generally not a good idea. You're most likely going to cache the views. So in your view itself, you would put in a CF cache at the top and bottom, and then every time that view is called, the cache would pull in the data that was there. So yes. All right. I mentioned briefly there are layers of caching in ORM. There's session and secondary level caches. This is really a topic in and of itself, in a presentation in and of itself, so I'm not going to go into a lot of it here. However, I show a few ways here that you can do caching when you're defining your components and your properties and your queries. So if you write a component, persistent equal true, and you're using ORM, and you would specify the cache use, which would be the read-only. There's a few others off the top of my head I can't remember, but you can look them up. There's a few different ways to do caching, again, because there's the session and secondary level caches on each property, which would be the equate to the table column in your database. You can cache that as well, and you can do that on a per property basis, so it would only cache specific properties. And then when you're doing your execute queries, you can put cacheable equals true and specify a cache name to cache that query into. And you can learn more about that both in the ColdFusion 9 and ColdFusion 10 application guide. I should have updated that. But specifically in the ColdFusion 9 applications guide, if you go to ColdFusion ORM, performance optimization, caching section, there's pages and pages and pages of details on ORM caching techniques. And again, there's some caveats between 9.0, 9.01, and 9.02. So 9.02 gave more functionality for the caching than the previous versions. And then I think 10 added a few more tweaks for caching as well. So if you're using ColdFusion 10, definitely check out the ColdFusion 10 applications guide, applications development guide.
I've got several people asking, should they upgrade from 9 to 10, and will that speed up their apps?
That's a double-edged sword, I feel. Yes, in some cases it will speed up your applications, but not significantly, not more significantly than doing some of the things we've already talked about here today.
And how about going from 8 or something earlier on the version?
Yeah, I mean, 8 I still work with a lot. I mean, a lot of my clients still have 8. They don't want to lay out the expense to go to 9 or 10. So a lot of them will stick with 8. There's a lot of performance enhancements in 9 over 8. Between 10 and 9, there weren't a lot of performance enhancements. It's mostly security enhancements. Between 10 and 11, there is more focus on performance again. So it'll probably be a more significant change for you to go from 8 or 9 to 11 than from 9 to 10, for example. 8 to 10 would be better. than 8 to 9. Well, actually,
Right.
probably not 8 to, but 8, 9, and 10 are almost on par with each other from what I've seen, performance-wise. There's a few tweaks, but most of it was done security. Most of the changes were security changes.
Right. It got Cutter saying that he found it helped his ORM to go from 9 to 10, so maybe that's one of the...
Well, like I said, they did add some additional tweaks to caching, so maybe that makes a difference. I haven't done an ORM app in 10 yet. Most of my clients are still stuck on 8 or 9.
So speaking of ORM, you've got some tips on that as well.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah, we went through those, I think.
So any other resources you can suggest that would help folks in speeding things up? And after we've covered those, we're going to cover any other questions people have.
All right. There are a few links I have here. Adobe's got like I said, they're developing applications, ColdFusion 9. That's a link to the session secondary cache details. There's also a section on optimizing ColdFusion applications in the developer's guide that is also worthy of reading. I haven't found any good blog posts for ColdFusion tags to avoid, which kind of surprised me, and I've been meaning to write one, but I haven't done it yet. But there are several that are noteworthy, so I think that eventually we'll get one out there, but I haven't found any good ones yet. And then performance tuning your ColdFusion servers. This is more about setting up how many requests you process, your memory variables, your JVM, and things like that. So performance tuning your application server, and Charlie can attest to this, can also speed up your applications quite a bit. So Duct has helped me do that quite a few times, and over the years, either vicariously or directly. So that's definitely something to have a look at, especially in your production environments. So those are just 3 links, and I can this presentation is available on SlideShare, and I think we can get a link to it as well.
Yeah, I'll put up a link after the presentation. So I've got I'm going to ask people another poll. I'm curious what people on the webinar have already done in their code, whether they've added timing to code to the key pages to see where it's slow, or optimized the SQL, or maybe they're using Fusion Reactor to monitor code slow pages, or rewritten their SQL, stored procedures, or maybe they're using some of these great caching techniques that you've talked about. So I'll go ahead and close the poll in 3, 2, 1, and here are the results. So looks like a fair chunk of people are using caching and optimizing their SQL. Not quite as many are checking timing or recoding. I don't know if this makes any sense to you, Denny, as to what you've seen out in the field.
Absolutely. Well, most of what I see out in the field, unfortunately, is code that needs lots of caching applied. But for applications that are out there, like Mira is a good example. Mira does tons of caching in their core code to speed up and remedy a lot of the slowness problems, and that's improved version over version. So yeah, anyone that's doing any of the open source stuff, 9 times out of 10 you're going to find that is using caching at some level, and even if it's not, it's fairly simple to employ. There are some other things that I wanted to talk about but didn't, such as using EHCache or Memcache. And those are additional ways you can cache your data with a little more control over them than you get natively out of ColdFusion. So those are some other things that I've seen more lately than not. As people switching over to some of that stuff, especially the Raylo team and the Raylo developers who are primarily doing Raylo. almost everything you see coming out of them is using caching.
And Charlie's mentioning cf911.com, which gives all kinds of server troubleshooting resources.
Absolutely. I use it religiously.
So let's go ahead to the Q&A, and got someone here. Bruce is asking, does cflock tag slow down performance, and if so, when should we really use cflock? And do you see it being used when it should not be being used?
Yeah, kind of my example I gave earlier was people that use cflock too liberally. So they use it in 4 or 5 or 6 different places in one block of code that's executing. The ideal way to use cflock is to lock once in a page and set all variables that you want at that point. That's not always practical, but for the most part, you want to rewrite your code so that everything gets locked once and all your variables get set then, instead of locking and unlocking and then locking and unlocking and then locking and unlocking. And yes, it does. It is blocking. So locking your scope variables is a blocking function, so it will stop execution of any other code while it's got the lock. Again, in smaller applications without a lot of web traffic, it's not a big deal, but when you get into enterprise-level applications with thousands of users, especially thousands of concurrent users, then you run into issues with locking a lot faster. So lock once, but only when you need to. That would be my suggestion.
Great. And then Todd is saying getting out of a shared web hosting environment could increase speed too. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's one of the issues the community has bounced around for a lot of years here. Shared hosting for ColdFusion typically, in most people's experience, was GoDaddy until they stopped doing ColdFusion. A lot of these providers will load up the server with so many clients that everyone's performance is affected. So if you are using a shared environment, it might be worthwhile to get a VPS or an EC2 environment instead, or a dedicated host in either case that just runs your code. Typically with VPSs, they can only put so many clients on a system, so they don't tend to overload VMs, but they do tend to overload shared hosting quite a bit.
Yeah, I definitely second that recommendation. If things are not running fast and this is a mission-critical app, get your own server, add a host, or yourself. Though in my experience, hosts are better equipped to get everything configured and run right, monitor it than most people are themselves.
Right. And you'll also get more service level agreements that way than you will with a shared host. Shared host, you get what you get. You go to a dedicated host or a VPS, you get a service level agreement that gives you quicker access to people that can help you solve your problems server-wise.
So what are your thoughts as to whether people should be optimizing when they start writing a new app, or whether they should wait till it's written and then optimize it once it's
I optimize
done?
as I go, but that's more out of habit these days. But yeah, I definitely optimize as I go, as I'm coding, and then I go back and optimize more afterwards. So you get as much of the work that you think needs to be done up front, and then after you go and do your load testings, you might discover areas that you missed and go back and take care of those. So for the most part, if you understand that, like I said, the states table should always be cached. We have 52 states, and even though we're trying to dominate the world, we're not claiming any more states yet. So that's one thing you can do, and I'm sure that's the same in other countries with their provinces and things like that. So if you cache that data, then you're just saving yourself that extra bit of processing time. And if you know that going into an application, then you'll know when you're writing it, go ahead and just cache that because you know it's going to be the same.
What about the trade-off between how maintainable the code is and how optimized it is? Is there a point when optimizing stuff or making it hard to read?
Not typically. Not typically. Not using the caching functions that I've shown here. I mean, well, there's two ways to go about that. One way is that when you're reading through the code, you'll see the CF cache, you'll see the cache within in the code itself. And the other way is to put liberal comments in your code to begin with, so that you're defining what you're doing in each step anyway, to a point where others can come in and just read the comments and have a fair understanding of what you're doing.
Okay, makes sense. I've got one final poll I'm going to ask. I'm kind of curious why people even care about speed in your apps, whether you've got upset users or afraid of losing clients, or your server's been crashing, or just you're getting hassled by senior management, or you're concerned about yeah, that can be a dangerous thing to happen there. Or maybe revenue loss. So I'll close this in 3, 2, 1, and sounds like upset users or crashing servers are the main thing, closely followed by looking bad to senior management.
Yeah.
So those are all good reasons to have a faster app. Okay, we've got a few more questions, and then we're going to need to wrap up. Miguel is asking, is there a way to avoid CF locking?
No. Next question. You want to lock your scopes. You want to lock your session and application scopes anytime that you're sending data into them. So that's why, again, I recommend you write your logic in a way that you're only locking once, instead of having to lock multiple times in a request.
Okay. And then got someone asking about OO access to the database, DAO, gateway services. Is that preferred to regular access in CFCs?
It depends. Models with your beans and your DAOs and your gateways are the way I write code. I use service layers for the DAO and gateway aspects. I combine those now, and then my models are the beans. Again, that's MVC terminology, but it's the same basic understanding. It's definitely the way to go for a lot of different reasons. One, if you write an application now doing it that way and later want to employ ORM, it's a lot easier to switch over to ORM having already written your application in an object-oriented way. In fact, it's almost painless at that point to go over to ORM. So that's one benefit. But the primary benefit of doing things that way is that it's as closely as possible mapped down into the Java, underlying Java. So you're basically creating classes that execute as you would write an actual Java class, with some differences, obviously. But your beans and your DAOs and your gateways end up looking more like Java beans and DAOs and gateways than not if you do it that way. And again, they execute faster. The encapsulation of your data means that you can do a lot of different things. You can set one data point instead of having to set the entire data struct type of thing. You can, it's just a lot easier, faster way to code, I feel, these days than procedural coding is.
Great. Well, we've come to the end of the hour, so really thank you, Denny, for all these great tips. As we mentioned earlier, the slides are already up on SlideShare, and I'll get them up, a link to that up on the TerraTech site in a few days, and also we'll get the recording of this up within a week. So thanks everyone for attending, and look forward to seeing you at another presentation. Hope you have a good Christmas. We'll be back in the new year. I think December has far too many things happening already to be